I've also learned to be much more down to earth. I don't quote theologians, and I don't, use Greek, and I don't say or do things that might give the congregation the impression that, I'm far more educated than they are, and they won't understand a word I have to say. To me, that's just not communicating. So I've become simpler, I think, as I've got older, and also less concerned with saying everything that there is to say in a particular sermon, because that's always a problem, and especially with students that I mentor now. They're very concerned not to leave anything out, and I always say, well, don't worry too much about that. You can always come back another time, but make sure that what you do say is understood and that you communicate.
Hi, welcome to the Expositors Collective Podcast, episode 198. I'm your host, Mike Neglia, and the voice that you just heard is that of Dr. Gerald Bray. Now, you heard him say that when he speaks, he tries not to give the impression that he's far more educated than the people that he's speaking to. But the truth is, Dr. Bray is probably one of the most educated people that I've ever spoken to in all of my life. Dr. Bray is a theologian, an ecclesiastical historian, and an ordained priest in the Church of England. He also is a fluent speaker of 9 languages: English, Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, German, Dutch, Greek, and Russian. He is a prolific author with dozens of titles to his name. Personally speaking, his systematic theology entitled God is Love has been one of my go-tos ever since it was published in 2012. And so I was really excited to get a chance to speak to him personally for this podcast. And we're actually partnering with our friends at Lexham Press to give away some copies of one of his most recent books. The book is entitled Preaching the Word with John Chrysostom, and is part of their Lived Theology series. And it's a good one, and you're able to enter to win a copy of it by following and connecting with us and Lexham Press on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And you can find us online and enter the contest. Details are going to be on our social media as well as on Lexham Press's social media. And you've got to enter by the 6th of December, 2021. I don't know when you're listening to this episode. Maybe it's decades in the future. But if you're listening to this episode on the week that it came out, you've got to enter right away. The offer ends December 6th. And so as you're listening to this conversation, make sure that you find Expositors Collective and Lexham Press on social media. Follow both accounts, like the post, tag your friends, and then you'll be entered to win a print copy of Preaching the Word with John Chrysostom by today's guest, Dr. Gerald Bray. So I hope that this giveaway, I hope that this episode, I hope that all that we do at Expositors Collective helps you to grow in your personal study and public proclamation of God's Word. Okay, here's today's episode. Well, hey, welcome to the Expositors Collective podcast. I am thrilled to be speaking with the Reverend Dr. Gerald Bray. Welcome to the podcast. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh.
Very well. Thank you very much.
There's a pregnant pause, or
I wasn't sure whether I was supposed to answer. Yes. Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you.
Wow. Yeah, you really know how to build some anticipation. So, well, yeah, Dr. Bray. So the first question that we ask nearly every guest is if you can remember your first sermon, or if you could bring us into the first time that you opened God's Word in public. Do you have a story for us?
Well, I can't remember my actual first sermon because that's going back about half a century now. And when I preached it, I wasn't planning to talk about it 50 years later. So I don't really remember. But I do remember very much the kind of training that I had in preaching. And it was very much the school of Martin Lloyd-Jones, of whom you will have heard, the kind of pastoral, very much pastoral preaching, going expository, going through the text of Scripture verse by verse, but also very concerned to apply it to the pastoral needs of the hearers. So that's something that would go back really to my early preaching days, and has stuck with me, until now. I mean, I'm always very concerned to relate whatever text it is I'm preaching on to the people I'm actually speaking to.
Okay. And where was that training? I mean, when you speak about training, did you get kind of mentored by somebody, or is this in a classical setting?
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
I trained in Cambridge, and most of what I learned about preaching, I learned from the minister of my home church, who was a Welshman and a great friend of Martin Lloyd-Jones, so very much in that circle. And so he taught me most of what I know.
That is great. A lot of the people, even from my own tradition, would be kind of more low churchmen. I hate to say it in your presence, but a lot of it is through these mentorships, relational connections, and so that you get kind of both streams with the Cambridge education and your own local pastor and investing in you, and who was probably invested in by somebody else as well.
Oh, undoubtedly, yes. Yes, that's right. And I learned a great deal there, and it stayed with me.
That's great. Well, the follow-on question from there is, I mean, over these 5 decades since that first sermon up until now, I know that you've handled God's word in a variety of contexts, but thinking of the preaching act, how have you grown or progressed in these past 50 years?
Well, I think I've learned to be shorter than I initially was, because in my early days I preached quite lengthy sermons.
Yeah.
30 to 50 minutes and so on. I still do preach that sort of time, I suppose, but less so. I mean, maybe half an hour at the most now. And I've learned to do that. I've also learned to be much more down to earth. I don't quote theologians, and I don't use Greek, and I don't do things that might give the congregation the impression that I'm far more educated than they are, and they won't understand a word I have to say. To me, that's just not communicating. So I've become simpler, I think, and as I've got older, and also less concerned with saying everything that there is to say in a particular sermon, because that's always a problem, and especially with students that I mentor now. They're very concerned not to leave anything out, and I always say, well, don't worry too much about that. You can always come back another time. But make sure that what you do say is understood and that you communicate. So that's really, I suppose, what I've learned, if I put it in general terms, over the years. I mean, I should say, of course, that I don't preach on a regular basis, or haven't done for a long time. So, most of what I do is lecturing in a college or university context. Although many of my students say that my lectures turn into sermons. So, there's an ingredient of that. There's an element of that in it. but I'm not really your normal sort of parish preacher.
Right. And I might comment and say it's probably a lot better if your lectures start to sound like sermons than if your sermons start to sound like lectures.
Well, that's right. Yes, that's very true. Yes, and but I tried to keep the two things together.
Right. Yeah, because of course there is, when a preacher gets up to preach, there is like a didactic, like you are teaching content to people. However,
oh yes,
if it's only an interesting lesson, then that is that's a real failure.
Mm-hmm.
What prompted you to intentionally start shortening your sermons? Was that like a conversation you had with somebody, or did you just notice people losing people after a certain minute mark?
Well, it wasn't a conversation with anybody. I don't know that I was particularly bothered about losing people. It was just more in my own preparation and self. I had more to say about less. And go into something more deeply. Then I realized that the difficulty then is that you end up repeating yourself. I mean, I don't know if you've ever read Martin Lloyd-Jones' sermons, but as one person said to me, if you don't get it the first time, don't worry, because he'll repeat himself at least 5 times before he comes to the end.
Right.
And that sort of, rang bells with me, and I thought, well, I don't want to do that. A certain amount of repetition is important and necessary, but don't overdo it. And I think if I've repeated myself 3 times, it's time to stop. So that's tended to make things a bit shorter over time.
Yeah. Well, a lot of younger or newer Bible teachers, sometimes, I was going to say that but I realized I'm at the stage of my life where I need to start saying they. I don't know if I count as a younger nor newer Bible teacher anymore. But I recall when I was younger that a long sermon almost felt like a badge of honor, that you were such a deep lover of God and student of his word that you're able to preach for 50 minutes on something. When in reality, looking back, realizing that's not serving the people very well, and how honoring is it to God's word if you essentially bore people to death with it by just going on and on, either trying to cram too many things or saying those things over and over and over again.
Yeah, well, that's right. And I think also when you're young and starting out, you really want to do a good job. You want, and you're very conscious of this. And if you've forgotten something or left something out, somebody might notice and pick you up on it and say, well, you didn't say anything about X thing or Y thing. But in actual fact, most people listening to sermons don't do that. They're not taking notes or analyzing what you're saying. They're just listening and hoping that something will sink in. So you get over that stage, I think, and just say, well, I just want to tell you this or that. And I think what matters, to me at least, is what you say has to come from the heart. If it doesn't come from the heart, it's not worth saying, because that's what people pick up. Even if they don't really grasp the meaning of what you've said, they know if it's coming from you and it's genuine conviction, and they trust you. I think that's very, very important to see that they have a relationship with the preacher, and realize that the preacher, yes, is sharing what he really believes. And so on, with you. And of course, I always preach my sermons to myself first of all, and that's the most important thing. And then it's remarkable what people pick up, because of course you don't know where they stand spiritually or what's going on in their minds. And something you say might trigger a reaction in them that you wouldn't expect, and I mean, I never forget one time when I was young and preaching in church, and a woman came up afterwards and said she wanted me to go and speak to a friend of hers about death, and I said, well, I'd be happy to do that, but why did you, pick? And she said, well, it was from your sermon this morning, and I said, well, I didn't say anything about death in the sermon. And she said, no. She said, but you sound like the kind of person who means what you say, and it would convince her. It would communicate to her. So I realized from that remark that that's what she picked up. I mean, not what I was actually saying, but when she wanted to know something or wanted to talk about a particular subject, she was prepared to ask about it and thought that I would be able to communicate. And that's always stayed with me to come across as convincing, and then people will pick you up where they are, and that has to be because you know yourself. I mean, you can't force other people to be somewhere spiritually where they're not. You just have to deal with them as they are, where they are. And sometimes I think preachers get a bit depressed because they're astonished that people in the congregation are thinking the kind of things that they think. It comes as a surprise. I mean, a few years ago, I was preaching in my home church on the question of forgiveness. And a woman in our church whom I know very well and have known for 40 years at least, and who's a very fine person, came up to me afterwards and said, I didn't agree with you. And of course, you know that how many people do that after a sermon. It actually did disagree. So I was quite intrigued. I said, what's the problem? And she said, well, you talked about forgiveness. And I said, yes. And she said, I don't know that I can be forgiven. She said, if you knew some of the things that I've done in my life, that I can't forgive myself for. I just can't understand this idea of forgiveness. And of course, part of me was thinking, my goodness, she's been sitting and hearing the gospel for a generation, and this aspect had never really sunk in. And I just said to her, I said, this is why Jesus came. Jesus, of course, God knows you can't forgive yourself. You're not meant to forgive yourself. He came to forgive you for the things that you can't forgive yourself for. And that was the first time that she'd actually got to grips with that particular thing. I mean, she'd heard it, of course, I don't know how many hundreds of times, but it hadn't sunk in precisely that way that communicated to her. And that was the moment when that happened. And you could just see the burden, fall away. And I think as a preacher, you have to expect that. You can't sort of turn to these people and say, what do you mean you don't know this? I've been preaching it for years. you just have to deal with what comes. And looking back on that, I'm grateful to God that he used that occasion, to bring that out. And that's something I think we need to remember too, that people are at very different stages and so on, and there's certain things that they may have not really seriously reflected on. They may have heard for many years, and they may know in their heads these things, but it just hasn't hit them in a particular way, and you have to be prepared for that.
Yeah, and so connecting back to a few moments ago, talking about the impulse that preachers might feel to say everything or to get everything out there. Is it kind of connected with that idea of like, well, I need to communicate all that I know to this person and the whole plan of salvation, so that this person will get it. But essentially, this friend of yours has heard it so many different times, but just needs to hear bit by bit, incrementally, and we plant and someone else waters, and God brings the increase.
Well, that's right, and it's some aspect of it. I mean, again, if I can go back to Martin Lloyd-Jones, his book Spiritual Depression, which I recommend to anybody, especially preachers, to read.
I'm going to read it tomorrow, actually. I pulled it off my bookshelf. I'm preaching on Psalm 42 this coming Sunday, and so I said, I need to revisit that book. So
yeah, well, I mean, one of the things he says, and it's very interesting, he says that it's often the problems that people have, the spiritual difficulties that people encounter, is because there's something about the gospel message that they haven't properly understood. Now, it may be that it's something that they've never been told, but it may also be something that they've been told, but they've never really absorbed. And he said the duty, he said, of the preacher and, of course, of the counselor is to figure out what that is.
Yeah, the problem is people aren't truly believing what they've heard. Is that?
Well, no, it may not be that they're not truly believing. It's hard to put it like that because, you're thinking in terms of orthodoxy and heresy and that kind of thing. It's not that. I think it's just there's some dimension of the message that hasn't sunk in, for whatever reason. And I think as Christians, and especially as evangelical Christians, we know the lingo, we know we know what to say, and it means something to us, especially if you're a preacher. You learn how it all fits together and all the rest of it. But forgetting that there are people, I'm not saying everybody, but there are certainly people in congregations, people out there who, for one reason or another, either don't have that kind of mind, that sort of thinks in a systematic and coherent way, or they just it's something that has passed them by, and it's rather like if you're going down the street in a town that you know very well, and then suddenly one day you see something that's been there for years, but you've never noticed it. And it sort of it startles you, and you think, oh, I've gone down this street I don't know how many years, but I never really stopped to look at this thing, or and then you see it in a new way, and I think it's that sort of thing, and of course it's true of all of us. I mean, I read the Bible. I mean, every day, and the Psalter through once a month and so on. But I'm always picking up things that, of course, I've read 1,000 times, but I haven't really meditated on it, or I haven't really thought of what the implications of that are. So I'm learning. I mean, I learn spiritually, every day as I read, and even things, stories that are quite familiar. There's always some dimension or some aspect of it that I may have just taken for granted and haven't really thought about what it really means, and how significant it is. I mean, I think one of the things I've discovered in preaching is that if I'm called to preach in a place that I don't normally preach in, which actually does happen quite a lot, I tend to take well-known things. I'll preach on the Lord's Prayer, or I'll preach on Psalm 23 or something like this, because I assume that everyone in the congregation, well, maybe not everyone, but a lot of the people in the congregation will know those things.
Yeah, it's a safe bet.
But probably they haven't heard any sermons on them, from their regular pastor. Because the regular pastor might be preaching through Romans or Ephesians or doing whatever he's doing. But, those things, familiar things, they may not have ever heard a sermon on. But I, working coming from outside, doing a sort of one-off thing, if I do that, if I preach, say, on the Lord's Prayer, I'm probably not interrupting the regular pastor or repeating what he's been saying.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm saying something that the congregation knows, they're familiar with, and they relate to, but have probably not reflected on, very deeply. So you can go deeper, if you like, with strangers, that people you don't know, but nevertheless, open the Word of God to them, and go into things because those particular things they are familiar with. And so that's something I recommend to people. If you get asked to preach in a church where you don't normally go, you can often get further by preaching on a text that everybody's familiar with.
Right. I kind of chuckled as you said that you would preach on a familiar passage like Psalm 23 of the Lord's Prayer, because I just preached on Psalm 23 2 weeks ago, and I did so with like fear and trembling because I was thinking like, oh, Psalm 23, this is everyone's favorite. I have to bring something forward that no one's ever said or heard about Psalm 23 before. And my wife gave me a good talking to, and she says, Mike, you just got to read the words, and just like press home those central truths. And that's what God's people need to hear. They don't need something new or novel from this well-loved passage. And she's right. She's often right. And then also too, I was reflecting or thinking about, when's the last time my church has heard a sermon on Psalm 23? And I was thinking, it's like, well, I did it at that funeral about 4 or 5 years ago, and not even everybody was there at that funeral. So there's this assumption, oh, everybody knows this or everyone's heard this. But it's like, well, actually about a portion of my congregation heard it 5 years ago. Therefore, It's okay to do it again. And, they're well-beloved Psalms for a reason. And so anyway, I kind of...
Well, that's right.
Yeah.
No, that's absolutely right. And, you mentioned Psalm 23 and you mentioned the funeral. I mean, one of the lines in Psalm 23 is, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. That particular line needs to be brought out.
Yeah.
Because we're always walking, well, not always, but very often walking through the valley of the shadow of death. What is this? Are you facing this in your own life? And that's an aspect of that psalm which is not usually stressed. It's kind of elided over, and it's there, but you pass on, and not to fear evil. To face the future with confidence, and a lot of people, especially now, especially with COVID and all that, it's very relevant.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned when you're a guest speaker, you like to do this. Mm-hmm. And Dr. Bray, a couple of days ago, I came across this excellent lecture that you did on the Beeson Divinity School YouTube channel, specifically focusing on that, on like what to do when you're a guest preacher somewhere. Mm-hmm. And I listened to it. It'll be in the show notes. And I totally think that everyone listening to this podcast should watch that next, because it's just brilliant about sermon construction and delivery. But specifically, you were saying that as a guest speaker, you should probably do a psalm. Do you remember that? And why did you suggest that guest speakers should do psalms?
Well, yes, I said it's a very good place to start for several reasons. First of all, the Psalms cover the whole range of human experience. They're very rich theologically, and you can get a lot out of a psalm. The other thing is they're self-contained. If you preach on, say, Romans chapter 5 or something like that, there's nothing wrong with that, of course. But if you're a guest preacher, you don't really know what to do, because do you spend the first 10 minutes explaining what the first 4 chapters of Romans are like, and you know what I mean. You've got to put it in context, and it takes time. I'm talking now about being a guest, not preaching through a series in your own church, but you're going somewhere strange, and you don't know what they're doing, but again, the likelihood is that the congregation you're going to speak to will not have heard a sermon on a particular psalm, because it's difficult to do a series on the Psalms.
I'm doing it right now. It's hard.
You are, but
It is hard, yeah.
And they're different. You see, they're all different. So you can pick up a psalm, Psalm 19 or Psalm 93 or whatever it is, fairly confident that people haven't heard anything about this recently, and treat it as a unit, as something which is self-contained in its text, and not worry about. Say if you're preaching on Psalm 93, you don't have to explain what Psalm 92 is all about, or Psalm 94, because that's not relevant really. You can just concentrate on that one, and of course you can choose the length too. You can preach on Psalm 119 if you feel you have to, or Psalm 117, with its 2 or 3 verses, and depending on the place you are and the time you have and so on. So there's a tremendous variety there, a lot of options. And of course, you can always bring in the gospel and so, for Psalm 22 or something like that. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? There are lots of possibilities. And I just recommend to students, if you don't know what to do, that's a good place to begin looking. Because, people will invite you to speak and they'll say, of course, say what you like, which sounds good. It's very nice, but it leaves you wondering, well, where do I start? And so, in that way, I would say that's a good thing. Of course, another thing I do sometimes is I'll take a short book of the Bible. I'll take the shorter epistles of John, the 2nd and 3rd John, or Philemon or Obadiah or something like that. That you can that again probably most people have never heard anything on.
Uncharted territory.
But you can cover them in one session, without straggling, without leaving people wondering what you're doing. So that's my advice to people who are asked to do something as a guest. And I say, well, I can do that. I can talk about that because that's mainly what I do. I can't think when I last preached a sermon series. I have done that, but it's a long time, since I've been in a position to be able to do that. Preaching regularly in the church.
I find that open-ended. Preach on whatever you like. That could be mildly petrifying or paralyzing. It's like, the Bible's a big book. What do you want me to do? I prefer, and I've been honored, I guess, when people say, "Hey, listen, we're doing a series through Hebrews. Could you do chapter 6?" Although that one's tricky, But when they just say, "Hey, we're doing this series. Can you just slot in?" And I appreciate the specificity. Yeah.
Yes. That's much more helpful, really, if in those circumstances. And that happens to me also. That someone will say, "Well, we're doing a series, and put me in a particular place," and that's fine. I wouldn't interrupt what's going on if I know that I'm expected to follow a pattern.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to talk to you about this at length, but I kind of realize we're supposed to be talking about John Chrysostom. We're supposed to be talking about patristics. And so because there's this incredible lecture that's already there on YouTube, I'm just going to point our listeners towards that if you want to hear more on this.
Mm-hmm.
But so why don't you tell us about why do you think that contemporary preachers in our day should be learning from early church leaders? What value is it? And then maybe even specifically John Chrysostom.
Well, I think what you can learn from John particularly He's one of the very few people from the early church who preached expository sermons in a series.
No one-off psalms for him.
No, well, but he was preaching regularly in a church. You see, I mean, he had a congregation, and his sermons have survived. I mean, he's certainly not the only person who did that kind of thing, but he's one of the few whose sermon series have been preserved. And I mean, we have 90 sermons from him on Matthew, for instance. Matthew's Gospel, 88 on John's Gospel. I mean, this is quite a legacy. I think there's 32 on Romans or something like that. So, you have very extensive sermons on portions of Scripture, and learning the art of expository preaching and a continuous series, and seeing how someone else has done it, I think is very useful. I think also what you see in John is the threefold pattern, which I may have mentioned in my lecture. I can't remember now, but you have exegesis, what the text actually says.
That's right. Yeah.
Exposition, what it means in the over script, over the whole counsel of God, the scriptures as a whole, the doctrine, and then application. How do we apply this in our own circumstances today? Now, if you look at it like that, theoretically, John has a great deal to say to us. He was a favorite with the reformers. I mean, Luther and Calvin and them, they loved John Chrysostom. He was their favorite father for this reason. Because he structured his sermons and his teaching in that way. Now, when you look at the detail, of course, and this is where we have to be careful today, because unfortunately some people go back to the early church and become patristic fundamentalists. And that's no good. But I mean, the weaknesses. The exegesis, John's exegesis, is compromised. I wouldn't say it's necessarily bad always, but it's compromised by the fact that he didn't know the original. Well, he knew Greek, of course. It was his mother tongue, but he didn't know Hebrew. So he wasn't reading the Old Testament, in Hebrew. It was in Greek translation, which is sometimes not correct. And I suppose the surprising thing from our point of view is that he never saw any need to learn Hebrew. It didn't bother him that he didn't know the original. So that's something where our approach would be quite different. Exposition, again, he did tend to sort of fall into allegory of one kind or another. He wasn't a major allegorizer in the way that some of the fathers were.
Yeah, not as much as some.
No, he wasn't. No, but he didn't always interpret the text. I mean, the obvious example in the creation narrative, and creation was very important to the fathers. He believed that the sexual intercourse did not begin until after the fall, and that in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve lived as celibates. Now, he believed that, he thought that, because in his own day, there was a sort of rising tide of monasticism and people seeking celibacy, and solitary life in the desert and so on. And so he just took his own situation. He did this himself and applied it to the Garden of Eden. But if you look at the Garden of Eden, God said to Adam and Eve, "Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth," which is not very easy to do if you're a celibate. So it doesn't really work. You see what I mean? Even on the basis of the text. I mean, you don't have to know Hebrew to figure that out. But John just ignored that because, he imposed his own theological perspective.
So you're saying it's possible for a preacher to be influenced by their culture and cause them to read things into the Bible that aren't actually there.
Well, that's right.
Aren't we glad that people don't do that anymore? Aren't we glad that that's done and dusted?
Well, I mean, if you live in the United States, that's a kind of daily occurrence.
Yeah.
People are doing this all the time, but people are doing this all the time, and this is something that we have to be very careful about. I mean, today you could say people have gone to the other extreme. You see that. Again, particularly in evangelical circles, celibacy is not particularly valued or honored, even though Jesus was celibate, the Apostle Paul was celibate, and the Apostle Paul recommended it. And a lot of preachers today, or pastors, evangelical pastors, if you bring this up, they'll kind of pass over it with an embarrassed silence or something. They don't really know what to make
even or even mock it.
Yes. I mean, which is going the other way. You see, so we're by no means innocent in our generation, and I think reading somebody like John is a corrective here, because you see how he misunderstood, or he went to the other extreme.
Right.
We do, of course, disagree with that. I think also his approach to Judaism was much more negative than we would be comfortable with today, which is not to say that you accept Judaism, as an alternative to Christianity or anything like that. But I mean, we are much more sensitive, I think, to the centuries of persecution of Jews, and so are careful about what we say, but also more aware of the essential Jewishness of the New Testament, Jesus and the disciples and so on. That that's the context in which they were operating, because John had no real historical awareness. I mean, he didn't think that Jesus lived in a different world from the world that he lived in. In some ways you can see why, because the Roman Empire was still in existence. The Greek language was still the common language of the East. So in many ways, things hadn't changed all that much. But there was no temple. There were no Pharisees. All the sort of culture of Palestine that you read about in the Gospels had disappeared. But John doesn't really seem to be aware of that, or take it very seriously. And he treats the Jews of his own time, as if they're Annas and Caiaphas and people like this. So, I mean, it's a different thing. So that's the problem. But what we can learn from him,
because he's this great model for us in many ways, and
yeah, that's right.
But let's give him a fair shake. What else?
Absolutely. No, the great thing is that he saw the need to meet people where they were.
Okay.
And you see this, for instance, in the way he interprets the wise men who come to Jesus to see the baby Jesus. And of course, the question that is posed for John, and indeed could still be posed today, is what do you mean the wise men found Jesus by looking at a star? I mean, they were astrologers. Is this some kind of justification for astrology? And John said, no, it's nothing to do with that. they said, well, why did God use this? What was going on? And John said, well, if you're going to communicate with people, if you're going to reach people, you have to reach them where they are. I said, there was no point expecting the wise men of Babylon to have read the Bible because they didn't know about that. So somehow or other, their interest had to be tweaked by something that they would appreciate. And the star was the thing. But then, of course, he also goes on to say that the star did not, in fact, lead the wise men to Jesus unaided, because what happened was the wise men went to Jerusalem, asked Herod, figured that Herod would know what was going on. Herod sends to the temple, gets the rabbis or whatever, the priests, to come out, and they point to the scriptures. And in the end, it is the scriptures that say it's in Bethlehem, so the wise men are directed to the scriptures. And of course, the other side was that they paid a heavy price for their astrology, because when they found the baby Jesus, then they were told to go home by another way, not to go back to Herod. But Herod ordered all the babies in Bethlehem to be put to death. So, it ended in tragedy in a way, and John's messages of, well, that's what's going to happen if you get mixed up with astrology. So he'll say that, yes, God started off on that, he met people in that way, but he had to move them on to somewhere else. And this is a constant. You see, John was in love with the Apostle Paul. He thought Paul was just the greatest thing out, and he really did, and to the point of exaggeration. For example, he said that Paul was a star athlete. Well, I don't think anybody would say this.
Because he referenced wrestling once or twice. Is that it?
Well, you see, this is it. No, it's just that because John realized that athletics requires a lot of training, dedication, commitment, and all this, you see. And so Paul was trained, and he was dedicated, and he was committed.
Oh, I see. Okay.
The fact that you can't really imagine Paul as any sort of athlete.
That's not how my mind works. Yeah,
that's just not, or he calls them the trumpet. You see, of the gospel and so on. So he overdoes it. He exaggerates, but the reason he does this is he sees Paul as somebody who is preeminently concerned with people. And you see, he reads the epistles, the Pauline epistles, as what we would call pastoral counseling. Whereas today, people who read the epistles tend to think of it as systematic theology.
Okay.
You're reading the doctrine. Well, and John wouldn't deny that, of course. He was perfectly orthodox in all that. But he would say, well, actually Paul is writing to real people in real situations with real problems. And you see this particularly in his long series on Romans. I don't know whether you've ever preached through Romans, you probably have, and other people do. But you get to Romans chapter 16, and you kind of run out of things to say, because it's just this long catalog of people that you don't know anything about.
Right.
And you don't know, what do you say?
Yeah.
Whereas John has two sermons on chapter 16, and says chapter 16 for him is the climax of the epistle to the Romans, the most important chapter. Why? Because he's dealing with people. And although John didn't know any more than you or I know about who Tryphena and Tryphosa were and all these people, he didn't know. But he did know that they were individuals in the congregation who needed to be spoken to. And John says, look what a great man this Paul is, because he doesn't just talk about justification by faith and Abraham and all that. he talks about you and me. He talks about unknown people. He's speaking to members of the congregation. He himself knew who they were. Well, that was the thing, you see. He said that even though Paul had never been to Rome, when he wrote his epistle, he knew about members of the congregation, and presumably some of them he'd met elsewhere. And he was very concerned with them and about them. And John says everything else Paul writes in Romans from chapter 1 on is basically to help these people. So he sees it like that. He sees it as a letter to a congregation, which needs more pastoral counseling in effect. And of course the others, I mean, obviously Corinthians and so on, I mean, it's much more obvious there. But that's what he says. And I think it's a very valuable corrective to us, that we will talk about original sin, and we'll talk about justification by faith, and we'll talk all these things, which are very true and very important and very necessary. But he puts flesh on the skeleton, on the theological skeleton, if you like, and always in his mind, can you think of, these are people in the church who are trying to wrestle with, what do we do with the Old Testament? What do we do with the Jewish law? And how do we understand where we belong? I mean, if I'm a Gentile and I've come into this group of converted Jewish Christians, how do we connect? How do we relate to each other? What do I have to do to be accepted by them? What do they have to do to accommodate me? This sort of thing. And always remember that dimension is there, through the epistle. And it's not just a theology lesson. It is a theology lesson, but it's a theology lesson rooted in real life. And that's what that's the great thing about John, and the great thing that we can learn from him. That we're talking about real people with real lives and real issues, and we need to be able to express our theology, not chuck it out, but express it in a way that's meaningful. And that so often it's because we either don't do this or can't do it. We haven't been taught to do it. That our ministry doesn't really go very far because it's not connecting.
Yeah. Well, even kind of like thinking back across this conversation, I mean, I love at the beginning, you're talking about the influence of your own pastor, who was influenced by Martin Lloyd-Jones, about like pastoral preaching and connecting to people. And then even talking about your own preaching, how you want to make it shorter for the purpose of like serving these people. And then as we kind of come to the end with John, like he is eminently like pastoral in his communications, like he has a giant brain, but he uses that to serve his people. And in, let's say, the preaching world, or people who listen to podcasts like this, sometimes we might even just think of like, well, the congregation, they're there to listen to us, or they're there so I have somebody to preach to. But it's this act of love. Nick Cady speaks about how preaching is an act of love, love to God by being faithful to his word, and then love to the people by communicating it as best as possible. And I'm really just calling out this like pastoral connection. Everything that's come out of your mouth has been like pastorally oriented, and that's really appreciated and needed today. And good. Yeah, and I'm looking at the clock too, and I kind of wish I started asking you questions about the early church earlier, but like everything you've been saying has been so helpful. So personally, I've just benefited from every step of this. Have you written anything about John?
Yes, I've written this little book called Preaching the Word.
Yes,
which takes you through different parts of the different things. I mean, it takes you through what John had to say about Genesis, what John had to say about the Gospels, and what John had to say about the Apostle Paul. So you get a good sample of things. And I would recommend my little book as an introduction.
Yeah.
I mean, that's of course what it's intended to be. And as one of the people who sponsored it, or wrote a little blurb at the front, Matthew Barrett from Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary says, read it on Chrysostom and then go read Chrysostom for yourself. And I would say amen to that. If people pick up this little book and then it encourages them to look for Chrysostom and read him for themselves, that would be good. I do warn you, though, that the most readily available translations of John Chrysostom were done in the 19th century and in a flowery kind of Victorian English that is almost as difficult to decipher as the original Greek sometimes. So you may find, John really needs to be retranslated into contemporary English, because he was a preacher. He spoke the language of the people, the language of the street, and not this flowery sort of rhetoric.
Okay. I generally come across them in the ancient Christian commentary on the New Testament. Are you familiar with that?
Oh yes, well yes.
And is that it's a little bit flowery now that I think of it. Is that a fresh translation?
Well, that's right. I mean, that's the 19th century translation.
Is it? Okay.
Because it comes from, probably those quotes are taken from the library of Nicene and post-Nicene fathers that Philip Schaff did in the 19th century, and there are various translators. I mean, I'm not trying to criticize them because they, that's 150 years ago that they were writing, but it's just that we don't talk like that now.
Sure.
We've moved on. I mean, you can still read it.
Oh, and I do.
It's not a foreign language.
Yeah.
But it might not give you the flavor of John, the sense of immediacy,
the punchiness that he evidently had.
That's right. That's what I'm looking for. Yes.
Well, excellent. Well, I mean, so we'll point people towards this, and our friends at Lexham Press are giving away some copies of this book, and so in just a few moments, you'll hear the outro where I'll explain more details as to how people can enter into this competition. But I mean, many of you will enter, not many of you will win. So you should go buy it. And if you go to lexham.com/expositors, there's going to be a place where you can get it even at a discounted rate. But I read it. I loved it. It made me want to seek out Dr. Bray for a further conversation to kind of introduce the listeners to John of Antioch, or John Chrysostom, if you're unfamiliar with him, and then also to be learning from the kind of pastoral heart and the pastoral preaching from Gerald Bray as well. So thank you so much for your time. It's been a delight. And I personally have learned from you, from your books, and even from this conversation. So thank you very much for sharing your time with us.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right. And I hope that this episode and all that we do at the Expositors Collective helps you to grow in your personal study and public proclamation of God's Word.
Thank you.
Well, hey, thank you so much. Man, wasn't that great? That man is a gentleman and a scholar in both senses of the word. And so now that maybe you have heard a bit about John Chrysostom for yourself, maybe you're curious, or maybe you want to read the book, remember, there's a giveaway that's happening this week. So up until the 6th of December, the competition is going on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And so make sure that you find us on those social media platforms, that you find Lexham Press, and that you enter, because we want you to have a free copy of this book. And if you don't win, we want you to go buy it. So go to lexhampress.com/expositors, where you can find a link to this book, as well as previous guests that have been authors that have published through Lexham in the past. So anyway, thanks so much to Lexham. Thanks so much to Gerald Bray. And thanks so much to you for listening.